and welcome to Neuronutrition Nuggets, the segment where I talk about the intersections of nutrition and psychological research. I also talk about the brain here, so some neurobiological stuff here too. Anyway, my name is Annika. I'm an ADHD nutrition research expert and science communicator. So really what that means is I have read an excessive amount of research, and I am here to help disseminate that research to all of y'all so that you can understand how to best support your ADHD through nutrition. So if this is something you want to learn more about, be sure that you are subscribed and make sure that you like this so that it pops up on your feed a little bit more. Anyway, thanks for all of my community members who actually support what I do. So a lot of this is not monetized at the time. So my community members through the NutriMed community are the people who are making this all possible. So huge shout out to this entire list of people. If you are interested in supporting my work and getting access to a lot of different amazing things like a community space, access to a lot of this research before people get it. And then I also have a lot of PDFs and different things to help you actually understand how to put this into practice. Because let's be honest, eating with ADHD is very difficult. So I have a lot of behavioral applications as well as some different dietary patterns to follow based on the research. So when you're ready to join the community, I have all that information in the description below. Anyway, let's get into aspartame. So aspartame is one of those ingredients that sparks immediate debate. Some people swear it's harmful, other people think the concerns are overblown. It's in a lot of different foods such as diet sodas and sugar-free gum, and it gets kind of a bad rap. So for those of us who are curious about brain function, especially with ADHD, it's worth asking, does aspartame actually affect our focus, our mood, our attention? Is this just another nutrition myth? Does it actually have neurotoxic effects? The internet is full of conflicting takes. So some say that it messes with the cognitive function and neurotransmitters, and then others argue that dose makes the poison and that there's no reason to worry. So let's dig into the research so that we can actually understand what's going on and make an informed decision for ourselves. So when we consume aspartame, it is metabolized into three components: phenylalanine, which is a large amino acid, and then aspartic acid, and then also methanol. So the concerns stem from how these may interact with the brain and the gut. When we look at research, most of the research on aspartame is done in rodent studies. The reason for this is because rodent studies are one of the best ways that we can actually investigate some of these different nutrition or non-nutritive substances and how it might affect us as humans. So we use rodents to provide just initial reactions to what it might do to us. Typically, they have excessive amounts, and they'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, some of the research in rodent studies indicates that methanol can break down into formaldehyde. And formaldehyde in excessive amounts can cause oxidative stress and can be cytotoxic, which basically it just means it can kill our cells, which is not good, right? So I'll talk about formaldehyde in a little bit as well, just to help us understand a little bit more what it is about. But going on to the next section, phenylalanine and aspartic acid, they are both involved in neurotransmitter activity, and it might decrease dopamine levels and serotonin levels in the brain, which is a key concern for ADHD brains, right? Like, we need both of those a lot. So the reason for this is because phenylalanine, like I said before, is a large amino acid. And when we consume amino acids, they can turn into different neurotransmitters. So why would consuming phenylalanine actually lead to a decrease in the dopamine? Because phenylalanine is actually the precursor to dopamine. So like, this doesn't make sense logically, but when we look at the actual metabolism of it, it does a little bit. So interestingly, once phenylalanine crosses the blood-brain barrier, it does not turn very effectively into tyrosine, which is the more immediate amino acid that turns into dopamine. So really, we want to make sure that we are consuming phenylalanine and turning it into tyrosine before it crosses the blood-brain barrier to promote optimal functioning of dopamine synthesis. However, when we consume aspartame, it really just has a large increase in phenylalanine, meaning that we're going to have a large increase in phenylalanine crossing the blood-brain barrier. So this is where it gets kind of tricky. Like I said, the tyrosine, it needs to be tyrosine in order to turn into dopamine, and once it's in the blood-brain barrier, phenylalanine doesn't really love turning into tyrosine. So that's why we could have a lower level of dopamine. The other aspect is that it crowds out other large amino acids like tryptophan. So tryptophan is a amino acid that turns into serotonin. So there's this something called a large amino acid transporter, the LAT1, and when it is working, a lot of our amino acids, basically it's like they're going on a bus, and if there's too many of one, they can like crowd out the others. So that is like kind of a simple way of talking about it. So that's how having too much aspartame could actually decrease our dopamine levels. And then the last one is that consuming aspartame could impact the gut microbiome negatively. So we do have research on rodent studies that looks at the gut microbiome and the aspartame consumption, and they do find that it can negatively impact the gut microbiome in the rodent studies. So based on all those rodent studies, it makes sense why there is this fear about aspartame and brain health. However, it's important to remember that humans are not rodents, and the doses in those studies that they give to the rodents are exceptionally high. So some of them even had doses of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. And when we look at what our dietary recommendations are for the limit that we should eat a day, it is 40 to 50 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So again, like a lot of these studies that find these negative aspects really are doing them in doses that are unrealistic for us as humans to be consuming. So that's another thing to think about. And then the last thing is that rodent studies give us the reasoning to ask for appropriate funding to perform studies in humans, which is great. And the human studies are the ones we want to focus on when making decisions about our lives. So let's quick look at some of the research with humans and ADHD and aspartame. This is where things get a little bit interesting. So a study on dietary patterns found that children with ADHD do consume more artificially flavored and sweetened beverages. However, correlation does not equal causation, and this could be more about the dietary habits of people with ADHD and less about the effects of aspartame. And when we look at the research that looks at whether or not aspartame impacts ADHD symptoms and not just the diagnosis, we do see that neither sugar nor aspartame negatively affects ADHD behavior in kids. The other thing to note is that there was a review of multiple studies that looked at different types of elimination diets, and they found that cutting aspartame made no significant difference in ADHD symptoms. And then the last thing I want to note here is time and time again, like this study from 2024, it found that aspartame does not impact the human gut microbiome. So even though there's a lot of people out there who might be saying that aspartame negatively impacts our gut microbiome, they're really only looking at the research studies done in rodents and not at the research studies done in humans. And now let's also talk about formaldehyde. So formaldehyde is that thing that a lot of people are concerned about with the whole aspartame aspect, because formaldehyde, like I said before, is a toxin, and it can essentially do a lot of oxidative stress and can kill a lot of our cells. So methanol, like I said before, is one of those things that aspartame breaks down into, and then methanol can turn into formaldehyde. But something that's often missing from the conversation is that our bodies produce formaldehyde naturally, and it is an actual important thing for our bodies to create and repair our DNA and RNA, and it's an incredible thing. Again, like, we just have a very limited understanding of our human biology, honestly. And when we look at the different conversations online, a lot of these nuances tend to get missed. So our bodies, like I said, do already produce formaldehyde naturally, and it's actually in significantly higher amounts than you'd get from aspartame. So this scientific review estimated that the human body naturally produces between 878 to 1,310 milligrams of formaldehyde per day as part of just natural metabolism. The amount of formaldehyde from aspartame metabolism specifically, if we were consuming the maximum daily intake, which was that 40 to 50 milligrams per kilogram a day, that would be about 4 milligrams per kilogram of day of formaldehyde, which is between 0.3 to 0.4% of what our bodies naturally make, which is less than 0.5%. So when we think about it, that is almost negligible. Like, that is an almost negligible amount of formaldehyde that our body processes. And it makes sense why we aren't seeing a lot of these actual impairments in our system when we intake aspartame, because it is such a negligible in addition to our formaldehyde. So again, while it's true that it can contribute to formaldehyde exposure, it's a very, very tiny fraction of what we already produce and clear efficiently. The dose and our ability to process it is what matters. But isn't formaldehyde a toxin? Why does the body produce it? So just like everything with nutrition, most things aren't good or bad. It's the context and the dose that matters. Case in point, formaldehyde isn't just a toxin, it is essential for life. So it plays a very key role in DNA and amino acid synthesis. So formaldehyde is needed for making purines, which are the essential building blocks of DNA and RNA. So without it, cell growth and repair wouldn't happen. While yes, if we have too much formaldehyde, it can actually kill those cytokines and it can kill those cells, but that's not really what we see, because a lot of us are not over-consuming products that contain formaldehyde or break down into formaldehyde. The next thing is that it is also involved in neurotransmitter function. So the body uses formaldehyde in the metabolism of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which is all critical for mood, focus, and cognitive function. And then the last thing here is that it's also found in natural foods. So many fruits and vegetables like apples and pears and tomatoes, they contain small amounts of formaldehyde. The body processes these in the same way that it would aspartame, because again, our body understands and is able to metabolize the things that we consume. So while high levels of inhaled formaldehyde can be harmful, these small amounts produced through normal metabolic processes are necessary and actually beneficial for health. So should we worry about aspartame? Honestly, even though the research is mixed with the rodent and the human studies, the thing is that there's no strong evidence that suggests that aspartame directly worsens ADHD symptoms or in general other brain or gut health for people. However, I will say here that individual sensitivity is real, and some people might notice headaches or mood swings or brain fog after consuming artificial sweeteners. So the important factor in general is that context matters. This review of the literature suggested that consuming aspartame with a protein-rich meal could mitigate some of those potential issues that we see. So if you're drinking a diet soda, I would suggest not drinking it on an empty stomach or not drinking it alongside a carb-heavy meal. Instead, I would suggest making sure that you are consuming it with like at least a cheese stick or some other form of protein with it. That way, the body can process it in just a better way than it would otherwise. Additionally, diet patterns as a whole are more impactful than any single ingredient. So if you are consuming a lot of artificial sweeteners and you're consuming a lot of whole foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, those are honestly going to mitigate any potential negative effects of the aspartame. You really do not need to worry about aspartame or food dye or anything like that if you are actually eating a basically mainly whole foods diet. The 80-20 method here of eating 80% mainly whole foods and 20% those other types of processed foods is just a really great guideline for understanding general health. The next thing is that if you feel sensitive to aspartame, just trust your own experience. And if you are not sensitive to it, there's no solid evidence that it directly harms the human brain, the body, or the gut microbiome. Yes, it does impair rats and other rodents in excessive amounts. However, thankfully, we do have federal guidelines that make sure we do not overconsume substances like aspartame. So there's something called the maximum permitted limit, which is basically the guidelines that the government has set out for a lot of these different things like food dye and aspartame. And it makes sure that the products that are being made do not consume or do not contain too much of a certain type of product, so that when we consume it in the regular amounts, we are not ingesting too much of the different nutrient substances. So yeah, that's the best approach. Just pay attention to your overall diet, prioritize nutrient-rich foods, experiment to see what feels your best, and then reduce any stress, because stress is the number one thing that's actually going to negatively impact your ADHD. So yeah, let's not stress about it. Personally, if you're wondering what I do, I take a conservative approach, and I generally avoid products that contain aspartame like Diet Coke. And that being said, if I were to drink a soda, I would choose a sugar-free version over a sugar version. The reason for this is there is a plethora of research out there on both sugar-sweetened beverages and alcohol and how they negatively affect ADHD. Those are the two products that are actually connected with negatively impacting ADHD symptoms. So yeah, if I were to choose, I would choose a non-sugar beverage. That being said, I also want to make sure we recognize that fruit juices, they do not go under the sugar sweetened beverages unless they are the ones that are not 100% fruit juice. So when you are purchasing your fruit juice, just look on the label, make sure it says 100% fruit juice. Otherwise, a lot of them are excessively sugared and are mainly sugar, and it's kind of like hummingbird water. So just keep all that in mind and just make the decision that is best for you and for your family. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to this. And again, huge shout out to all of my NutriMind community members. Whenever you are ready to join, I'm excited to meet you, and make sure that you just tap that link in the description, and I will see you soon.